So the Conservative government in my home province of Ontario, Canada, recently passed what might just be the dumbest and most counterproductive bit of transportation legislation I've ever seen. In their Reducing Gridlock, Saving You Time Act, cute name there guys, keep up the great work, there is a requirement that all cities in Ontario must get provincial approval before installing any bicycle lanes that affect car lanes in any way. After the initial announcement, the Conservative government doubled down on the policy, stating that they're going to remove existing bicycle lanes as well, and that they've already started the process of removing them on 3 streets in Toronto. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, justified this legislation because bike lanes are, quote, bringing traffic in our cities to a standstill. This is obviously an absurd statement. Like, Toronto has absolutely terrible traffic congestion, and it has been getting worse over the past few decades. But there are 5,600 kilometers of roads in Toronto, and less than 3% of them have bike lanes on them. And what's more insane is that there are less than 40 kilometers of protected bicycle lanes, the ones that are the target of this legislation. Does anyone seriously believe that removing a couple of bike lanes on less than 1% of roads will have any meaningful impact on traffic in Toronto? The Ontario Conservatives have pointed to reports that show car travel times have increased on some of the roads with bike lanes in Toronto at certain times of the day. For example, here on Yonge Street during the morning rush hour, vehicle travel times going north have increased by 20 seconds. Going south, travel times have decreased by 30 seconds, but we don't talk about that. And this is in a city where car travel times have been increasing all over the place, even on streets without bike lanes. Plus, the biggest recent increase in traffic has been caused by construction projects anyway. By the way, if you're curious as to why taking out car lanes has little to no effect on driver travel times, it's because on city streets the flow of cars is constricted by intersection capacity. One car lane provides more than enough capacity between intersections, which is why in the Netherlands it's been common practice for years to build streets with only one lane in each direction for cars, and then to optimize intersections with efficient turning lanes and traffic light timings. And Build the Lanes has a great video about this if you'd like to learn more, link in the description. Ford says that we need to, quote, bring sanity back to bike lane decisions as they only benefit the 1.2% of Torontonians who commute to work by bicycle. And he got that number directly from the Canadian census from 2011. So this data is totally out of date, but regardless, cycling is much, much more than just going to work. Even here in the Netherlands, there are millions of people who drive to work but regularly use their bicycles for local trips. A 2019 City of Toronto survey found that 44% of Torontonians identified as utilitarian cyclists who use a bicycle to go to work, but also school, shopping, or visiting friends. That's up from 29% in 2009. And there's been a massive increase in the number of people using Toronto Bike Share, which had 5.7 million trips last year. Of course, the major reason for this huge jump in cycling trips is the bike lanes that Doug Ford wants to tear out, which is why his government needs to use 13-year-old data to try to justify this ridiculous policy. And all of those people who currently cycle today aren't just going to disappear if the bicycle lanes are taken away. They're either going to continue cycling, in which case they'll be in the way of cars, or more likely they won't feel safe cycling anymore, so they'll drive instead. Regardless, though, I object to the entire concept of framing urban improvements as an issue of traffic flow. These aren't highways. They're not even suburban arterial roads. They're downtown urban streets in Canada's largest city. These streets have many uses, and the majority of them are more important than moving cars. For example, they're lined with shops and restaurants that are important to the fabric of the city, but also to the financial success of the businesses that operate there. The local business association that represents 270 businesses along Bloor put out an official response that said removing the bicycle lanes would be, quote, disastrous for the area, and that their monthly customer spending has increased since the bicycle lanes were installed. And yeah, a Toronto City study showed that this is true. Retail sales on Bloor increased after the bike lanes were installed, an effect that wasn't found on other nearby streets. An increase in business revenue from bike lanes has been consistently seen in many other cities, and one of the major reasons for this is because car speeds are slower. On city streets, there is a direct correlation between the speed and volume of car traffic and the financial viability of local businesses, because cars don't buy things, people do. And people don't want to shop next to polluted streets with high-speed traffic. And slower doesn't even have to mean less travel capacity, as car traffic flows much more efficiently if it moves at a slow but consistent speed. It really does work better for everyone. So it's not surprising that even the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers put out a statement against the bill, saying that it was, quote, a step in the wrong direction for Ontario's future. All of the streets identified by Ford for bike lane removal are directly under subway lines, and they're in mixed-use neighborhoods in the most walkable parts of the city. The vast majority of people here arrive by walking, cycling, and public transit. That economic study of businesses on Bloor Street showed that only 10% of people arrived by car. More importantly, though, the bike lanes have also made the streets safer. And again, this is a result that has been shown time and time again to be true in cities all over the world. In fact, let's hear it from Doug Ford himself when TV Ontario made him ride a bike for the first time in 35 years.
You're nervous when there's not bike lanes. At least I was. Someone dings you from behind, and we have to do everything we can to make sure there's never a death in the city. One death is way too many when it comes to bicycle riders. We have to make sure that they're safe. And I felt so much safer when it was separated.
Thanks, Doug. I agree. One death is way too many. An extensive 13-year study of multiple cities has shown that bicycle lanes make the streets safer for everyone, including pedestrians and drivers, not just people on bikes. And this is not the only study that has come to the same result. Which is why I reject the basic premise of this new legislation. A civilized society should never accept trading people's lives in order to shave a few seconds off of a driver's rush hour commute. So let's be really clear here. People will die as a direct result of this legislation, and it won't just be people on bikes. And all of this is still assuming that bike lanes cause traffic congestion when they're literally part of the solution. Decades of research has shown that there is no solution to car traffic except viable alternatives to driving. That doesn't mean everyone needs to walk, bike, or take transit, but they do have to be viable options. And the cities that have made the boldest moves towards improving their cycling network have seen the biggest decreases in car traffic. A leaked document from Ford's own Ministry of Transportation staffers advised against the policy, citing research showing that quality bicycle infrastructure reduced car congestion, which Ford, of course, completely ignored. Toronto is only just now barely getting to the point where their protected bicycle network downtown is becoming a viable alternative. Many of the gaps in the network are getting filled, and some half-decent infrastructure is getting installed. A lot of these bike lanes are still pretty shit, to be honest, but they are getting better. And downtown Toronto is surrounded by traditional neighborhoods where a lot of people cycle already. There's really no good reason why cycling in and around downtown Toronto couldn't be as popular as a northern European city like Copenhagen if the right infrastructure was built. And no, winter is not an issue. I have a whole other video about that. Stop making excuses. Doug Ford claimed that the bike lanes have created a, quote, absolute disaster for emergency services. Unsurprisingly, this came as a surprise to Toronto Fire and Ambulance Services, who both said that they have not raised any concerns. In fact, the deputy fire chief said that according to their data, response times have actually improved since the bike lanes were installed. I've also talked before about how bicycle lanes, if designed properly, can significantly speed up emergency response times, as they have done in the Netherlands. As another justification, Doug claimed that 50,000 people had signed a petition to have the Bloor bike lanes removed, which is false. That's just a lie. I could go on like this, telling you about each blatant lie told by the Ford administration along with evidence to the contrary, but I'm not going to do that. If you want, I've left lots of links in the description to the advocates and news organizations who have done this work already. What I do want to talk about are the actual reasons why this legislation was created and why it was created at this time, because it has nothing to do with bike lanes and everything to do with distraction. Plus a little bit of spite. For the past few weeks, I have been unable to go online without somebody telling me about this ridiculous bike lane legislation. At least 100 people have told me about it. Fans of the channel, but also friends, old colleagues, professional urban planners in Canada. Even my mom texted me about it. But I didn't know what to say except, yeah, that's why we don't live there anymore. It's because of stuff like this. while I have packed up, moved to the Netherlands, renounced my Canadian citizenship, and became Dutch, A+ decision by the way, can recommend, I still have a lot of ties back to Ontario, and I would generally prefer that things get better there as time goes on and not worse. But I also didn't want to just make a video that countered each of Doug's lies, because he lies a lot. You can tell he's lying right now because his lips are moving. Does anybody remember this guy who stood behind him during a press conference when he was city councillor? Nothing has changed. Instead, I want to talk about the history and context behind this ridiculous legislation. Doug Ford is a populist conservative politician and the premier of Ontario. For the Americans, it's like a governor of a state. One of his campaign slogans was "Buck a beer," his promise to make beer cheaper. I'm actually really familiar with old Douggie because he was previously a Toronto city councillor, and during my time as a safe streets advocate in Toronto, I was excessively involved in municipal politics. After advocates, researchers, and city staff would spend months, if not years, studying and analyzing some great street improvement, Doug would rant about respecting taxpayers and vote it down. But he was happy to vote for anything, regardless of the cost, if it benefited drivers or property developers. While populists can tell a good story and are very good at getting elected, they're typically not so great at actually managing a government, and Doug is very much this kind of politician. He didn't even manage to make beer cheaper. Who would have thought that when deregulated, companies would increase their profits rather than decreasing their prices? Meanwhile, Ontario is not doing so well. There are major problems in healthcare, finance, education, transportation, and the housing crisis is one of the worst in the world. So it's not really surprising that Doug's approval rating is the lowest of any provincial premier in Canada. And there's an ongoing investigation into corruption just for good measure. Right now, Doug is looking for any opportunity possible to gain political points and to distract from the absolutely atrocious state of the province due to his incompetent leadership. And that is the context of this bike lane legislation. It is first and foremost a distraction. Transportation in Ontario is pretty bad, and I've talked about this in several of my previous videos. There is really no good way to get around. Public transportation is extremely limited in most of the province. In my hometown, the bus is the option of last resort. And I've ranted many times about how difficult and expensive it is to take the train there. Commuter rail in the Greater Toronto Area is definitely much better, and big improvements are being worked on, but right now it's often difficult to use for trips that aren't commuting. In Toronto, the subway is dealing with overcrowding and aging equipment. The streetcars routinely get stuck in traffic behind cars, so it's often faster to walk. The bike network, while improving, still has a lot of gaps and lots of terrible quality infrastructure. And all of this is due to a long history of Toronto prioritizing cars over all other forms of transportation, and I have a whole other video that talks about that in more detail if you want to learn more. But the sad reality is that if you design a city or a province almost exclusively for cars, then everybody will have to drive, which leads to crippling traffic congestion. And so Ontario, and especially Toronto, sucks for driving too. And it's so frustrating because driving in the Netherlands, where bicycle lanes are everywhere, is so much better than driving in Ontario. And I made a previous video about that if you'd like to learn more. Decades of research has shown that there is no solution to car traffic except viable alternatives to driving. And traffic is terrible in Toronto because there are very few viable alternatives to driving, especially in the suburbs. So why doesn't Toronto have those alternatives? Well, that's what Doug is trying to distract you from. The Eglinton Crosstown is a light rail line currently under construction in Toronto. It's the first new major rail line to be added to Toronto's transit map in decades, and it will finally provide an east-to-west connection for Midtown. It was supposed to be completed in 2020, but as of the end of 2024, it's still not open. Okay, so a major transit project that's behind schedule and over budget isn't unheard of, especially when it's in a city that hasn't built this kind of transit in a while. But you might be curious, as many people are, as to when the Crosstown is expected to open, and that's the thing. Nobody knows, because there's no public schedule. Even the mayor of Toronto doesn't know when it will open. The project is managed by Metrolinx, a government transit agency that reports directly to the Ontario government. Ford became the Premier of Ontario in 2018. The Eglinton Crosstown LRT was supposed to open in 2020. It has now entered its 14th year of construction, and the only public schedule for this $13 billion project is, and I kid you not, we'll let you know when we're 3 months away from opening. And this article is from over a year ago. The performance of Metrolinx is something that Doug Ford and his transportation minister, Prabmeet Sarkaria, are directly responsible for. Their total lack of schedule and communication is completely within their control. But instead of admitting that Doug and his government have grossly mismanaged one of Toronto's biggest transit projects in decades, they want you to fight about bike lanes instead. Unsurprisingly, Prabmeet is also the minister who introduced this ridiculous bike lane legislation. Global News filed 2 Freedom of Information requests to find out what was going on with the Crosstown schedule, and they were denied in part because they would affect, quote, the economic interests of the province. Toronto councillor Mike Cole, who is also the vice chair of the Toronto Infrastructure Committee, summarizes the issue perfectly.
God forbid he should complete the effing Eglinton Crosstown. If we had the Eglinton Crosstown running, the Finch LRT running, you can imagine that would do something, but no. So after 5 weeks of holidays, where Queen's Park didn't even sit, the first thing they do when they come back to Queen's Park, bike lanes. Not healthcare, not the homeless, not the catastrophe in housing. No. The highest unemployment in Canada is in Ontario. No. Bike lanes.
What's worse is that this Eglinton LRT, along with the one on Finch, were both part of Transit City, a 2007 plan by the City of Toronto to build an extensive network of LRT lines across the city. Unfortunately, this project was cancelled when 2 Conservative politicians were elected to Toronto City Council in 2010. Mayor Rob Ford and his brother Doug. And in a style that will become a trend, they cancelled Transit City without Toronto City Council approval. This kicked off a legal and political battle that resulted in Toronto being out at least $85 million in sunk costs, and in the end, only 2 LRT lines were left, and the project was delayed at least 2 years. So let's be clear here, if it weren't for Doug Ford and his brother, these 2 LRT lines, and likely several others, would already be in operation, significantly reducing traffic congestion in the city of Toronto. But yeah, it's the bike lanes. And in researching this video, I was getting really pissed off watching this habitual liar use these 2 LRT lines as proof that his government is building transit.
Finch West LRT, the Eglinton Crosstown extension,
when the only reason they're getting built at all is because competent politicians fought back against him trying to cancel them. Incidentally, the Eglinton Crosstown LRT was originally planned as the Eglinton West Subway, and construction started on that line in 1994. But when Ontario elected its previous Conservative government in 1995, they promptly canceled the project and filled in the tunnels that had already been dug. Not that Doug. So Doug, that Doug, is continuing a long line of Conservative politicians screwing up transit projects. Which is why I always tell people voting left doesn't guarantee that you'll get a great city, but voting right does guarantee that you won't. Now, in Doug's defense, he is not completely anti-transit. In Ontario, you can deny the viability of cycling, but you can't deny the viability of public transit. Which is why a year after becoming premier, he took a Toronto subway plan that was already under development, made some changes to suit his preferences, renamed it the Ontario Line, and pretended it was his idea. And as usual, he did it without involving Toronto City Council, so the announcement was a surprise to everyone working on the project. But while Doug is interested in subway projects that he can put his name on, he's not very concerned about actual subway riders. He claims that bike lanes need to be torn out immediately because of the perceived delay to car drivers, but the data available shows that these delays, if there are any delays at all, are usually measured in seconds. Meanwhile, the busiest subway in Toronto, a subway that incidentally moves more people per day than the busiest highway in Toronto, has had reduced speed zones in effect for over a year. This is due to delayed maintenance that has resulted in unsafe track conditions on a huge portion of the subway network. These reduced speeds are adding up to 15 minutes, not seconds, of delay to the travel times of subway riders. This is a problem that was caused by a lack of funding for transit, something that could be solved by the Ford government, but neither Doug Ford nor his transportation minister have said anything about it. In fact, the Reducing Gridlock, Saving You Time Act doesn't mention anything at all about improving transit service. They are only interested in saving you time if you drive to work, not if you take transit. And this is the consistent message he and his government have sent. Cars come first, and anything else has to fit around the cars. Which has the ultimate effect of having too many cars in the city because there are no viable alternatives to driving. But Doug doesn't want you to think about all that. He wants you to blame the cyclists. Of course, it's a very common trick for populist politicians to target some minority demographic and blame them for everything that's gone wrong. It may seem insane to my Dutch audience, but in Canada, cyclists are considered to be a certain group of people different from everyone else. This has become a really lame culture war issue, and cyclists have been the target of conservative politicians and right-wing media for several decades now. All of this has its roots in climate change denialism, but that's a story for another time. Honestly, this stupid dynamic is one of the most annoying things about trying to ride a bicycle in Ontario, and I have a whole other video about it from the early days of this channel if you want to learn more. It's also pretty much guaranteed that anybody who rides a bicycle is also never going to vote for Doug Ford, so he's fine literally throwing them under the literal bus. Here is a map of Toronto showing in green and yellow in which areas many people use a bicycle to get to work, and here is a map showing the districts that voted for Doug in blue. There's no overlap. Additionally, most people in Ontario live somewhere car-centric. These are places where you'd pretty much have to be insane to ride a bicycle, so cycling is basically irrelevant to most people in the province. So cyclists are a really easy target for Doug with very few political consequences. But Toronto is different. According to the latest census, not the crusty old one that Doug likes to cite, there are neighborhoods in Toronto where up to a quarter of residents cycle to work, and of course, that still excludes all other trips like shopping, going into appointments, and visiting friends. Even when we last lived in Toronto over 6 years ago, cycling was becoming pretty normalized. Sure, there were some ignorant suburbanites who would drive in from the car-centric suburbs and complain about bike lanes, but a non-trivial number of my coworkers would cycle to work. Because as more protected bicycle lanes were built, more regular people felt safe enough to ride a bicycle, and so cycling was becoming just another option available, giving people more freedom to choose how they get around. But working as a manager and an executive at several Toronto startup companies, I also saw how this bicycle infrastructure became valuable when hiring. If you work in tech and you just want to make as much money as possible, you move to the US. It's not even debatable. The only reason you would work in Canada is if you valued something else other than just money, such as quality of life. So Canadian companies, especially tech companies, really need something else to offer if they want to hire talented people. When I was hiring product managers and software developers, there were several candidates who valued the fact that our office was downtown and near protected bicycle lanes. It was literally one of our selling points when hiring. The reason these people valued working in downtown Toronto was because of its urbanism, because of the mixed-use neighborhoods and the streetcars and the walkability, and yes, because of the bike lanes too. I remember talking to other tech people in Toronto about this, how we wish that there was one place in Ontario, just one, that wasn't a car-infested wasteland. Is that too much to ask? If Toronto loses its bike infrastructure and backslides into becoming just another typical North American car-centric city, then there will be people, young, smart, talented people, who will just leave. Why bother paying the insane costs of housing if it's just as shitty as everywhere else? Now, you might notice that I've talked almost exclusively about Toronto so far, but apparently there are other cities in Ontario, or so I'm told. But that's intentional because despite the fact that this bike lane legislation would apply to all cities in the province, the only one the Ford government has targeted is Toronto. For example, when questioned by the press in Ottawa, Ford said that he wasn't concerned about Ottawa and that he was focused only on Toronto. And this follows a trend of Ford being obsessed with the city of Toronto since his election. Ford is from Toronto, of course, and he was a Toronto City Councillor too. But what's more important is that before he was premier, he tried to run for mayor of Toronto and lost. Ford did not take this well, and since becoming premier, a significant amount of his time has been spent trying to meddle in Toronto politics. The press have been pointing out his weird obsession with Toronto for years and how it's preventing his government from properly managing the rest of the province. For example, literally the first thing Doug did when he became premier was to cut the number of city councillors in Toronto from 47 to 25, and he did this right in the middle of a municipal election. He didn't do this to any other city in Ontario, and a lot of people suspected that he did it out of spite to punish City Council and the people of Toronto. And if you're thinking, that's stupid and childish, yes it is, but that's who we're dealing with here. I observed exactly this kind of behavior from Doug Ford when he was a Toronto City Councillor. He's an insecure, spoiled rich bully who became CEO of his dad's company and thinks he's a business mogul. Now he likes to pretend that he's the CEO of Ontario, and since he outranks the mayor, he can do whatever he wants, and he has no respect for dissenting opinions or the democratic process. This whole bike lane circus is just another example of that, more stupid, wasteful, and petty legislation designed to punish the city of Toronto for rejecting him. Ford claims that this legislation is needed for, quote, bringing sanity back to bike lane decisions, and that they're just asking cities to do more due diligence and research before building this kind of infrastructure. But you might have noticed that I've quoted several studies that have already been done in Toronto, from traffic counts to business revenue to emergency vehicle response times. Bike infrastructure projects in Toronto have received intense scrutiny. And there's a reason for that, because we need more studies has been a consistent tactic used by Toronto suburban councillors to delay, water down, and reject urbanist projects in Toronto for years. Of course, this is not exactly a new technique. Tobacco companies would regularly claim that more research was needed when it was becoming clear that cigarettes cause cancer, and fossil fuel companies have done exactly the same thing with climate change for decades. Ontario cities are already painfully slow at building bike infrastructure. Montreal in Quebec, a city that is smaller than Toronto with much harsher winters, not only has significantly more on-street bicycle lanes than Toronto, they're also significantly safer and better designed. And they plan to add twice as many kilometers of new bike lanes as Toronto is planning too. Bike lanes are already insanely overstudied in Ontario as it is. There are no other infrastructure projects where so much time and money is spent researching them versus the time and money spent implementing them. Meanwhile, there's not nearly as much scrutiny for car projects that are orders of magnitude more expensive. Toronto already has the widest freeway in North America, Highway 401, and Americans, before you write it in the comments, know the Katy Freeway in Houston is not wider than the 401 through Toronto. The Katy only has more lanes if you include the frontage roads, which don't count as these have traffic lights and are therefore not part of the freeway. But anyway, the 401 is routinely jammed with traffic at basically all times of the day. There must be some really big bike lanes nearby to cause all this traffic, eh? Of course, this is actually because for several generations, the Toronto area has built infrastructure that is almost exclusively for cars, and I have a previous video about that if you'd like to learn more. Decades of research has shown that there is no solution to car traffic except viable alternatives to driving. Every time we build highways or widen roads, the amount of traffic congestion increases, and Toronto is a textbook example of that. So this is a major problem for the city of Toronto. And Doug Ford's solution to all this is the world's longest road tunnel. This proposed tunnel would be over 50 kilometers long, more than twice the length of the Lardal Tunnel in Norway, which is the current world's longest road tunnel. The Big Dig, a tunnel project in Boston, was the most expensive highway project in US history. It took 16 years to complete and cost over $20 billion in today's dollars. That's US dollars, of course, and Doug's proposed tunnel would be 4 times longer. Experts were very quick to point out that the 401 tunnel project is completely unrealistic and wouldn't solve Toronto's traffic problems anyway. In response to criticism from experts, Prabmeet, Doug's Minister of Transportation, said that,
we're not going to take no for an answer.
So you might be thinking that it's rather hypocritical that the Ford government is demanding that tiny little bike lane projects need extensive study and review, while their unprecedented plan for the longest highway tunnel in the world is self-evident and is going to happen no matter what.
But I'll tell you one thing, we're getting this tunnel built.
But the truth is that they don't care about research, data, facts, or studies. The only thing they care about is buying suburban votes and distracting from their incompetence. The vast majority of people in Ontario live somewhere car-centric, and riding a bicycle there is dangerous and infeasible. But even if you don't care at all about bicycles, this legislation should still concern you. The first is an issue of cost. These bicycle lanes are not trivial to remove, especially the ones on Bloor. The current estimate is $48 million. Toronto City Council has rightfully balked at paying to remove infrastructure that their constituents don't want them to remove. So Ford has said that the province will pay for it. If you live outside of Toronto, I hope you're happy with tens of millions of your tax dollars going to remove a bunch of bike lanes that you've never even seen for no measurable benefit. You should also be concerned about government overreach. Why should a provincial government have any say at all in what happens in cities at a neighborhood level? We have different levels of government for a reason. Higher levels of government can provide funding to cities, and there may be requirements placed on that funding in order to receive it, but provinces interfering with local decisions made by the democratically elected municipal government is a blatant abuse of power. What's the next municipal issue Ford decides that he deserves supreme executive power over? And you should be concerned that your provincial government is wasting time and money on stupid distractions and minor municipal issues, instead of solving the real problems that are affecting Ontario. And of course, the absolute last thing we need is more bureaucracy and red tape when it comes to building transportation infrastructure. In fact, a major part of Doug Ford's campaign was the promise of simplifying regulations and reducing red tape. Ford was so concerned about it that he created the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction. Somebody from that department really needs to have a talk with Prabmeet in the Ministry of Transportation. Actually, let's just see who Ford appointed as the first Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction. It's him! It's the same guy! Of course, that's not a coincidence. The whole point of all this is to make it too difficult and expensive for cities to install new bicycle lanes, so that all of the space between sidewalks can be devoted entirely to cars. The Conservatives are just fine with red tape, as long as it's hurting a group of people that don't vote for them. But of the 3 bicycle lanes that the Ford government wants to forcibly remove, there's one that's very curious: University Avenue. University is an absolutely massive road that really should not exist at all in the middle of downtown in Canada's largest city, but regardless, there's plenty of room here. The traffic studies show, quote, limited to no impacts on motor vehicle travel times after the bike lanes were installed, even at rush hour. There are several hospitals along University, and despite the lies told by Ford, they have not reported any problems with emergency response times due to the bike lanes. Nobody has any issues with these bike lanes. So why have they targeted these bike lanes specifically? Yeah, it's because their office, Queen's Park, is on this road. It's entirely due to selfishness and spite. Sarkaria wrote an opinion piece in the Toronto Star, and it absolutely reeks of entitlement. In it, he writes, I leave my house in Brampton, say goodbye to my wife and daughters, and take a leap of faith that I'll be able to get to the office on time. By car, of course. This is a guy who lives in a typical financially insolvent car-dependent suburb, and since he doesn't live in Toronto, he doesn't pay any property tax there. And he works at a government office in downtown Toronto. His city has a commuter rail station. His office is next to a subway station. It's literally called Queen's Park, so he can't even get lost. But no, that's not good enough for him. Not only does he expect to be able to drive there, he expects his commute to be easy and free of traffic in the downtown of the largest city in Canada. And because his commute doesn't live up to his expectations of convenience, he wants to remove bicycle lanes that have been proven to make the streets safer. This selfish, entitled suburbanite is willing to let people die for the hope of shaving a few minutes off of his commute. And after his mildly inconvenient commute, Prabmeet gets to go home to his wife and daughters. But what about the Torontonians who can never do that again because they died on University Avenue? And Prabmeet knows that this will cause injury and death because that scumbag added a last-minute amendment to the bill that says people cannot sue his Conservative government if they're injured due to the bicycle lane being removed. I honestly don't know how to respond to this in any other way other than, go f*** yourself, Prabmeet, you f***ing piece of I hope you and then in Minecraft, of course. Canada is a democratic country, and the people who live in downtown Toronto and pay taxes there get the opportunity to directly vote for their local city councillor. And they have consistently voted for representatives who want better public spaces, faster public transit, fewer cars, and yes, more bicycle lanes. But Doug and his Ontario Conservatives don't like that. They feel entitled to overrule the decisions of the democratically elected representatives of Toronto for their own political gain and selfish agendas. And I reject that. If you live in Ontario, you should be angry. The only reason this is happening is because Doug thinks he can get away with it. He thinks Ontarians are stupid and easily distracted, and he thinks he can make people fight over bike lanes instead of shining a spotlight on his incompetence. If you'd like to fight back against this blatantly undemocratic bullshit, I'll leave some links to advocacy groups below, and I can personally recommend joining Cycle Toronto, as well as Friends and Families for Safe Streets. And if you live in Ontario, I would strongly recommend that you contact your local MP, but also Doug Ford and his Minister of Red Tape Escalation, Prabmeet Sarkaria. Phone calls are always better than emails, but visiting their office in person is even better, maybe even as a group. I'll leave contact information below. Doug and Prabmeet think they can get away with this as an easy political win. Let's make it hard for them. In Canada, the contact information of our politicians is readily available online, which makes it really easy to give them a call to express your concerns. This is important because, in a democratic country, we need to ensure that our elected representatives can be held accountable. But if you're not a politician, you probably shouldn't have your personal data available on the internet, as it can be used for scams and identity theft. I use a service called Incogni to automatically remove my personal information from the internet, and since I've been happy with their service for over a year now, I asked them to sponsor this video. Your personal information is stored in hundreds of databases online. Most of it will originate from websites or online stores that you've used in the past, but those companies can make extra money by selling the information in their databases to data brokers who collect massive amounts of personal data about people from multiple sources and then package it up to be sold to whoever is willing to pay for it. In the US, this can be even worse, as your information can end up on people search sites that publish detailed personal profiles online. There are many of these sites that expose home addresses, financial information, and even family details, posing risks of scam, harassment, and stalking. But these data brokers also become a huge target for hackers as well. Recently, the data broker National Public Data was hacked in what was likely the largest data breach in history. The leak included people's names, addresses, phone numbers, date of birth, and social security numbers. And an analysis of the leak confirmed that the information of people who use data removal services like Incogni could not be found in the database, which is why I'm motivated to remove my personal data from as many databases as possible. I am an EU resident and now a citizen too, so I am covered by a data protection law called the General Data Protection Regulation. This allows me to send a GDPR request to have my personal information removed. I have done this many times and it works. I've seen my information disappear from publicly accessible websites. But this is a very time-consuming manual process, and I need to know who has my information before I can even send a GDPR request in the first place. Regardless of where you live, though, Incogni takes care of this for you. They reach out to data brokers on your behalf, request the removal of your personal data using whichever method is most successful in your country, and they manage any objections too. And with a yearly subscription to Incogni, they will continuously follow up, ensuring that your data stays off the market in the future too. Incogni also offers a family and friends plan, which allows you to protect up to 4 people on one account. So if you're concerned about data privacy, I recommend trying Incogni. You can sign up at incogni.com/notjustbikes or use the promo code notjustbikes at checkout for 60% off an annual subscription. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.